Last year, when the official Gaunt's Ghost plastic kit was released, on Instagram, Warhammer TV Peachy also posted these models. And a few of the Gaunt's Ghost fans, including myself, were quite interested in what the official accepted conversion of a Gaunt's Ghost model might look like, and how they were made. Well, it turns out they're made from masking tape. Well, needless to say, we laughed, we scoffed. Of course the official accepted conversion wouldn't use something that might actually look good, like a third-party component. But I got to thinking that maybe there's more to it, because these models did end up looking pretty good. So hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and I'm going to build a few models with some masking tape cloaks to see just how effective it might be. And for that, I'll need some models. And good for me, I got some scrap bits of Imperial Guard recently, thank you Grandpa Werewolf. But in that bundle there weren't many legs, and so I've printed off a bunch from Divic Designs' Celtic Guardians set to just complete these models, other than the cloaks, which will be made from masking tape. And I pretty much just got stuck in, but I wanted some variety in the different cloaks just to test out which might look better. And so for some I used a knife and cut very neat edges, and for some I tore the edges to try and get a bit more of a raggedy look. For one, I cut a kind of cape style piece to put on the back, and then some strips to go around the chest. For another, I made a one-part piece that's surprisingly similar to my cloak mould from last year. And for the others, just mixing strips and scraps to make different sorts of effects. I quickly realised that small pieces of tape like this are very fiddly to work with, but it didn't take too long at all to have all 4 models taped up. And so let's look at what I was able to make in just a few minutes. This first model, the running one, has a single piece cloak cut with a knife. Second one, kneeling with bayonet, has a torn cloak with various scraps over the shoulders. The third, yeeting grenade, neatly cut with strips around the hem. And lastly, kneeling with helmet, has quite a scrappy one, swooped quite nicely to the side. But essentially being made of sticky paper, these aren't particularly strong, and so I thought I might look at some possibilities of strengthening them. So I grabbed the supplies that I thought would most likely be helpful from my collection of stuff, and I came up with super glue, PVA glue, and an acrylic varnish that's quite old. This bottle is from the 1970s. And if any of you at home know of any other supply that might be even more effective, well, let me know in the comments down below, because maybe this is worth revisiting later. So I applied these various goops to the models. Firstly, superglue went onto the kneeling with bayonet model, and I gently pushed it around with a toothpick to make as even as a coat as I could manage. PVA glue went on the grenade yeeter, and somehow I made an absolute mess of this, but such is the life of a hobbyer. Finally, the kneeling with helmet model got the acrylic varnish, which is an option I haven't used very much. Like I say, this is an old bottle and it's barely been used. As a control, the running model got no strengthening glue of any type. Now with any glue you're going to want to make sure it's properly dry before you put any paint on, otherwise you'll wreck your brushes. So let's look at what the models were like after 2 hours of drying time. The running model with no glue is, as you would expect, still quite soft. The masking tape has no structure and is pretty floppy. The superglue one on the kneeling bayonet is much firmer, but there's still a lot of flex, and it strangely does return to its shape quite nicely, but there's no cracking or anything in the surface. Both the PVA and varnish versions behaved pretty much identically, and they're almost as soft as the non-glued version. But one important fact here is that I noticed that they are very securely attached to the shoulders. Checking back on the non-glued model, the masking tape here is having trouble sticking to the plastic, and with no additional glue there, it's kind of peeling away. But all 3 of the ones with some type of glue, they're all securely attached to the shoulders. And moving on to the next step, which is of course to paint. I checked after the primer, but there was really no change in how they behaved, so I skipped that for the video. And so here's me getting stuck into the base coats. Dark green, of course, because that's how I paint my Tanith cloaks. And straight away I noticed one negative to this kind of technique, and that is that the cloaks, all 4 of them, were bending down under the pressure of the brush. Now the superglue one, being the firmest, did behave the best at this, but even so it was flexing enough to be annoying when painting. A second coat with a lighter green to make some highlights in the folds and edges And while this was a little easier because I'm painting higher up on the models, where the shoulders of the model are supporting the tape, I did find that my paints were flowing fairly nicely from the brush to all 4 of the cloaks. None of them were so smooth or so coarse that they were causing problems with the paint. One thing I would like is much nicer defined folds running through the cloaks, and this is something I think can probably be achieved with some practice of applying the tape in different ways in the first step. But given that this is my first attempt, they're a little flat and lifeless. I did particularly notice the edges of the cloaks at this step, and I think this is more of a aesthetic difference than an actual technical one. And I would personally say that the very nice neat cut edges are a little too neat. They don't fit in scale. It kind of shows off that they are like tape or some other thing that's not fabric. Whereas the torn edges, so long as they're torn in a fairly straight line, really do look like the kind of slightly tatty edge of cloth. And finally I can move on to the camo pattern, which I paint as a whole heap of fleckles in various colours. And even here, with such a light pressure of the brush for each spot, the cloaks were moving under pressure, even the superglue one. But to keep this video somewhat expedient, I'm only painting the cloaks, and I'll leave the rest of the models for another time. So we can come to a conclusion and some of the important notes that I might make. In terms of colour, they all take paint really well, and comparing them to some existing models with resin or metal cloaks, there's no real difference in the colour here, and that's even counting that these models were painted with different paints. Every dark green is a dark green, I guess. Overall, I am pretty surprised at how well they came out in comparison to proper cloaks. But the last thing I'm worried about is how long they'll last, how durable they are. Our running model has a very floppy cloak. It seems to me that masking tape without any strengthening will just be weak and susceptible to getting caught and ripped. The PVA and varnish versions have somewhat of a protection. They do kind of sit fairly flat, but they are still fairly soft and could get caught. The superglue one is the best of the bunch. It is the firmest of them, so if you position it around the model in a way that it's not going to get caught, it might survive a bit longer. But if it does get caught, it absolutely can still get ripped. So I will say that if you want to try this at home, there's a few points that I can give you in kind of a winning recipe, as it were. And that would be A, to tear the edges of the masking tape rather than to cut them neatly, because I feel like that looks a little better. B, try to induce some folds in the masking tape as you're putting them on the model. And C, use superglue to strengthen them. And if you do use superglue, like ventilated area here, folks, this is an important one because spreading the superglue out over a large area means that the vapours are released very quickly, and that can get unpleasant. Well, with my little experiment done, I can discard all of these cloaks and put some proper ones on them. Except that my entire Tanith First and Only army has a wide variety of cloaks, and so some of these might not look amiss, and I think the superglue one is actually worth keeping as it is. The others, however, well, we can test to see just how fragile they are. Fairly fragile. No. So this is the grenade yeeting one, and that's actually surprisingly tough. Yeah. Let's give it a real pull. There we go. I can destroy it in the end. I would have to put about that much effort to break a bayonet off of one of these models, so that's actually really surprising. And last attempt. That one more separated than tore because it wasn't complete around the neck. So I guess just the glue didn't quite hold it on. But it's interesting that these can take quite so much abuse, and the paint's not tearing on any of them doing this, and they're kind of still holding their shape. In fact, they are starting to get a little more wrinkly, which kind of adds to the effect, actually makes them look a little nicer. So please feel free to share this video with anyone who you think is being a snob about using cheap supplies for model making, because these actually came out surprisingly well given the material that they're made from. And post in the comments if you have any suggestions for future experiments. But for now, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.